Well, the theme today is, why do you come to church? Feel free to keep some notes on the back of the order of service. I'd love to hear from you afterward. You see, the next 2 weeks are going to be kind of a refresher course in Unitarian Universalism, and every question you ever wanted to know about our church and were afraid to ask. Reverend White will be preaching 2 sermons in the next 2 weeks. So today I thought we'd ramp to that and ask the question why you go to church. I'm not looking for holier than thou answers. As I've said before, the holier than thou are hell to live with. And I want to admit to you that I preach, as always, to myself as much as I do to you. I figured out a way to get myself to church. I get paid to come to church. If you're in a partnership and you're having a struggle with getting to church, you might pay each other to come to church. That might be an answer. But the question is why you would come here. I've heard many answers to that question. I've heard personal answers to that question. I've heard that the sign out front that said, "Open Sundays," that's the one I wrote, drew you to us. I've heard personal stories like the one of Annie Lamott that Beth read. A person struggling with addiction, hungover, looking for only greasy food in the flea market, but hears the music and wanders in. And I've heard that some of you come out of habit. I call the people who have been coming here 50 plus years through rain and snow and excessive heat, I call them the church postal workers. Some of you are here. They've come no matter what the sermon was, no matter what the minister was saying, through some very average sermons and less than average. And I've heard that some of you come because of the sermon title. I want to clue you into something. Don't come because of the sermon title. Oftentimes the title really doesn't drive anything. We actually have had people call up midweek. Now, tell me about the sermon title. We had someone call this year, the week before Easter, and said that the sermon title is Easter's Resurrection. Now, tell me about the sermon. What is that all about? Don't be that person. But come because of the reasons you come. And you might think about that today. Some of the reasons come from the kind of poem that was read today by Beth. Riven is, I believe, an Old English word that means to tear. That when our lives are torn, when they are broken, we sometimes find the church is a place to go. A place to attempt to mend those tears. And that's fine too. And sometimes when the world is riven, when the world is torn, we come to church. I came back to church when the first Gulf War started. I was living in Burlington, Vermont, a place where at the top of Church Street is a church. At the top of the church is not a cross, but a clock. It's a Unitarian church. And I went in and I sat in the back on the right, and I listened, peering through the beams that held up that old church at a church that knew how to wrestle with a broken world, a world that was broken by war. And I assume some of you come here for that reason also, and now in this time. For sure, our world feels broken. I want to revisit what I said last week about Black Lives Matter. This week, Beth and I and a rabbi and organizers from Dallas Area Interfaith were down at Truly Baptist Church down near Fair Park. We were meeting with their pastor who asked us to come and help. You see, one of his members had been shot by an off-duty police person. Now here's the rub. The man had had his house broken into, and he called the police, and they did not come. So he protected his house the way he could. And then the robbers came back, and he followed the robbers out, and in the midst of pursuing the robbers, an off-duty policeman shot him. In the midst of our meeting, we said, why is this happening? The rabbi sitting with us said, I know some reasons. One is that as white people, we have taken privilege of being white to a new level. We have even made it an addiction. You see, in our neighborhood, when we call the police, they come. We assume that if we were out pursuing a thief, we wouldn't be shot through the door of our car even before we stepped out. When I say Black Lives Matter, that's what I mean. We're living in a broken world around bias. And it comes as a shock to some white folks that we are even saying these words. I think partly because white folks thought we had a covenant. We thought we had a covenant around peace and tranquility that I believe the black community knew was never there. And so there were two reactions. And in our churches we have heard, no, all lives matter. Yes, true. But particularly now, the riven part of our community has to do with race and bias. And as we walk through the world that we have, we also see that that riven part is drawing us apart from each other even further around gay and lesbian issues. We stood here and held hands and celebrated the marriage equality just a month ago. And just this week, members of an ultra-conservative group in Houston are calling for the removal of all gay people from Houston. I would like to see that happen, to try to see if they could try to make that happen. It seems crazy, but it echoes to ghettoization that anyone who lived through the 1940s understands is a dangerous idea. And we live in a riven world around women's rights, and I know you know that I am part of the clergy association at Planned Parenthood. And personally, I have been attacked in this moment when these videos are going up and lies are being told about the treatment of women and the fetal tissues that they are donating to help others' lives. Just this past week through the blogosphere, all the names, all the pictures, and all the contact information of the clergy who support women through Planned Parenthood has been released like a police blotter to incite something. Now, we are taking it seriously. We are not naive. But this kind of warpath mentality is present in our riven world. And it feels very personal to me right now, a reason I would go to church. When the world is torn, when the world is riven, we seek something. Maybe I've touched a little on some of the ideas of why you are here. And that riven world leads to doubt, and it leads to despair. And the goal of the church has always been to move from that broken place, from those riven places to God. And I know, you know, when I use that word, I mean that thing that pulls us to our highest ideals. The church has always been about moving toward God, moving from the broken, moving from barrenness to wholeness, from emptiness to the fullness of the Spirit. At its best, that is what the church has aimed to do. God goes belonging to every riven thing he has made, said the poet. The theologian Christian Wyman is a poet. He was the editor of Poetry Magazine, is the focus of today's sermon through his interview with Krista Tippett. And I read through and I listened to the interview, and what I heard was his leaving church and his returning to church and the struggle that he had, the doubt and the despair, both of losing the church and in returning to it. You see, he was a young man. He grew up, like many of you, in Baptist church in Texas. He was steeped deeply in the culture of that church. And he found at one point it did not fit who he was. And then he was diagnosed with an incurable disease. And he found himself focused back to find a church that spoke to his heart. His life was riven, but he also understood that God goes belonging to every riven thing God has made. He returned to the church and he found the evangelical church a commercialized spirituality bare of any depth. And he found the liberal church implicating some of our churches as being too casual and not taking care in its theology and in its wording. He said we must find a credible middle ground. I want to quote to you something from the interview because I think it's in part why we come here together. He said, being religious or taking on some sort of religious element in your life, you're not necessarily saying, I agree with everything that this religion says. What you are saying is that I've had these incredible experiences in my life of suffering or joy or both. And they have demanded some action of me and demanded some continuity of me. And the only way I know to do this is to try to find some form in it and try to share it with other people. I do not need to go to church, he said. I need specifically religious elements in my life. I find that if I just turn all of my spiritual impulses, if I let them be solitary, as I am comfortable in being, I'm comfortable sitting reading books and trying to pray and to meditate. Inevitably, if that energy is not focused outward, it becomes despairing. It turns in on itself. And I will look up in some months and I will find that I am in despair. So I think that one of the ways that we know that our spiritual inclinations are valid is that they lead us out of ourselves. And I would say they lead us into community, as he is pointing, community that makes a continuity of our lives, that deals with our doubt and our despair and the riven parts of who we are. And I just want to take a little side note here and remind you that what I'm talking about here in this place is a faith that believes doubt is part and parcel of being a person of faith, believes that doubt is part of that pursuit that he is talking about, that creating a continuity within ourselves. John Patrick Shanley, the author of the play Doubt, said, doubt is an open door. He said, it's a dynamic process, and I think this discomfort that many people have with doubt is not something to be overcome, as something to be enjoyed, and I say to that, amen. A faith here doesn't rest on beliefs, like Alan Watts said, that sits in the road. A faith here is based on doubts. It is based on finding ways to mend those riven parts. A faith here pulls us towards something that we do not create, something that we do not control, something that we do not even need to name. A faith here pulls us towards something, a reminder that life matters, that it is precious, that it is not all fluff, that it means something to go through day to day, to interact with the people we interact with. It reminds us that we cannot control as much as we want to be in control, that we are part of a river of human life, and we must find some trust in that, and that we do not need to name that thing that pulls us along. This faith in this place, I think, points to the reasons why we come here. To heal the riven things, to heal the broken hearts, the broken parts of who we are, to mend them, to follow the urge of the Spirit, to be held, to be reminded that the world is sacred, as I said last week, and to have faith, to name and share what's important in our lives with others, to move us outward and not to do it in isolation. I've always said that there is no Unitarian Universalist who lives in isolation, because part of our faith is to create that continuity and then to move outward, to be tested, to be known. I want to close with a story. It's a story about a young man who's was living a successful life. He had most of everything he wanted. He woke up on Saturday mornings and went to the corner cafe and saw friends and had breakfast and enjoyed life as it was. But something was missing. There were breakups and there were loss, but more than that, there was a gap in his heart. A chasm of two worlds. The world of childhood and the world of adulthood. The world of going along and getting things done and the world of having a greater impact on the world around. The world of the real and the world of the illusory that he chased down bottles of alcohol. Like a magic wood, those two worlds were guarded by a spell. They were riven inside him. But one day he answered the call to try to unify those worlds. He stepped through the doors of a church that had a sign that said something like Open Sundays. And he sat and he listened. And over time, even a long time, parts of him came together. Places and time wove together, past and present, the everyday and the meaning of impact, the real and the illusory. And that was faith. That was a deep confidence in doubting, a deep confidence in his place in the world, a hope for the future, a commitment to make the world a better place. And over time, he sang with more gusto in the pews and understood that human hands and human arms were there for holding. And he knew a God, even when the world seemed godless. a God he could not name some days, but a God he rested in anyway. And it happened because of a church at the top of Church Street, with a clock at the top, and the people inside struggling with the war. And that person was me. You see, I don't just come here because you pay me to come. It helps, because I am undisciplined. But I come here because I know the power of a place like this, to mend the heart, to point beyond, to hold us in the truth of what it means to be alive. So I hope you come here for those reasons too. Amen and amen.